What was that so far?
Is this on continually
Yep.
recording?
Yep. Well,
It's not. Is it motion or is it?
event,
Okay, so it's motion.
Any motion event that happens, I get cars driving from this street, and this is him at 517. I usually park out there on the side. I just want to get everything back in. Be easier so lugging everything out there, all the tools that I had to bring in.
What is one true crime case that you just can't stop thinking about? I always wonder what really happened to 6-year-old Catherine Korzelius. On August 7th, 1996, Catherine, along with her mom Nancy and her brother Chris, were out running errands. Catherine's dad was Paul Korzelius, who at the time was the tour manager for Jon Bon Jovi. That day was Paul's birthday, so they were all out looking for a present for him. They all lived on Elder Circle, which is a small neighborhood near Austin, Texas. When they got back to Elder Circle, Catherine wanted to pick up the mail from the community mailbox and then walk home. The mailboxes were only about 1/8 of a mile from their home, and Catherine had done this a few times before, so her mom let her. Catherine would take the shorter route home, while her mom and brother would take the longer route around Elder Circle. This way, they would be getting home at almost the same time. But once Nancy and Chris got home with still no sign of Catherine, Nancy sent Chris to go and look for her. But when Chris couldn't find her, Nancy started searching for her by car. Within minutes, they found her laying in the middle of the road on Elder Circle. She was unconscious but still breathing. According to Nancy, she didn't want to make her daughter lay on the hot pavement, so she picked her up and took her to the hospital. Little Catherine suffered from a fractured skull and never regained consciousness, and sadly, she died later that day. Authorities initially thought that Catherine was a victim of a hit and run, but certain things didn't add up. Where Catherine's body was found was in an unusual spot. Her mom last saw her walking towards their house, but her body was found a little over a mile away from their home in the opposite direction that she was supposed to have gone. Catherine's body was actually found along the route that her mom and brother took to get home, and the autopsy only deepened the mystery. The autopsy showed that Catherine didn't die from a hit and run. Along with her head injury, she also had abrasions on her left shoulder, lower back, right hip, and her knees. The ME found that Catherine had either jumped, fallen, or was thrown from a moving vehicle. One theory investigators came up with was that Catherine maybe tried to hold on to the back of her mom's car on the drive home, but fell off. This would explain the location of where her body was found. But her family did not believe this, so they hired a PI. The PI noted that it was a really hot summer day, and at the time, Catherine's left thumb was broken and in a splint, so it would have been really difficult for her to hold on to anything. And it's likely her mom would have seen her in the rearview mirror. Catherine's family believes she was abducted and murdered. After her death, investigators brought in a canine unit that tracked her scent to a vacant lot 30 yards from the mailboxes, but it was lost after that. This sparked a theory that Catherine was approached by an attacker at the mailboxes, ran into the lot, was caught and thrown into a car, struck in the head, and then was thrown out of the vehicle where she was found. Nancy also stated that it appeared her daughter's body was laid out for her to find. Her hair was smoothed down, her clothes were straight, and her sandals were still on. Unfortunately, there's never been any answers in this case, and it's still labeled a suspicious death. Jon Bon Jovi wrote a song dedicated to Catherine called August 7, 415. And sadly, in March of 2020, Catherine's brother Chris, who grew up to be a police officer, was tragically killed in a car accident.
A lot of people think I'm crazy for not going out on a cruise, but I just really don't like the idea of how anything can happen out on the open ocean. First of all, the ocean is a perfect place to hide a body. All you have to do is dump it. By the time the boat docks and authorities can get on board, so much time has passed and you can dispose of a lot of evidence. Also, water washes away evidence, so it's really hard to investigate. This is the case with Colleen Wood. In fall 2000, she set off on a long-term sailing trip with her boyfriend of 1.5 years, John Paul Sr. They both loved sailing. It was how they met actually, and she was looking forward to visiting different ports at different countries and getting some amazing Christmas presents for her grandkids. To her loved one's concern, she sells all of her possessions on land, including like designer clothes and her condo, which she sells for $40,000. According to her, John Paul says that there's no point in paying for something that she's not even going to be using. She's last heard from in early December when she calls her son to tell him about the Christmas present she got, and then when she calls her friend to say that she will be attending her Christmas party. However, Christmas and New Year's came and went, and there was no word from Colleen. Her increasingly concerned son calls her cell phone and finds out that it was shut off due to lack of payment. He also decides to Google his mom's boyfriend, and this is when he finds something bone-chilling. Just months before meeting Colleen, John Paul had just finished up serving time in prison for attempted murder. He was dealing drugs and his business partner ratted him out, and he decided to pay him back by shooting him. He also finds out that John Paul's ex-wife, Shalise Paul, is also a missing persons case. She was last seen when she drove down to Florida to reconcile with her ex-husband. After he docks in Florida, the police interrogate John Paul, and he says that he and Colleen broke up. He tells them several contrasting stories about how she left when he docked and she came back to get some of her stuff with a football player boyfriend. Police wanted to arrest John Paul, but this was just a disappearance and not a murder case, and there wasn't any evidence besides the fact that she was last seen with him. A few days later, they try to contact him again, and they find out that he sailed away on his boat, Island Girl, the day after the police interviewed him. Shortly before she went missing, Colleen's credit card was used to place an ad in the classified section of a newspaper looking for a sailing partner, and it was used again to place an ad in the man-seeking woman section. Even worse, $40,000 is withdrawn from her bank account in separate increments from different ATMs. The police tracked down the people who made these withdrawals, and it was two random young women who said a man came up to them on the street and gave them cash for getting this money out for him. To this day, the police haven't been able to locate the man who certainly killed Colleen. He's been spotted at different ports but never stays there for more than a few days.
Last Meal Monday, where every Monday I tell you what a killer on death row had as their final meal. This week we're going to talk about Judy Bueno Ano. Judy grew up in an incredibly abusive household. By the time she was 14, she was sentenced to prison for attacking her father, stepmother, and two stepbrothers. Once released, she was placed in a reform school, and in 1971, at the age of 17, ended up getting pregnant and giving birth to her eldest son, Michael. In 1962, Judy ended up marrying James Goodyear and having two more children with him. They lived what appeared to be a pretty happy life until 1971, when James started getting really sick. By September of 1971, James had passed away, and the cause of death was listed as natural causes. The following year, in 1972, Judy met Bobby Harris, and they began a relationship. Ultimately, in 1977, she and her children ended up moving to Colorado to live with Bobby. And the next year, in 1978, Bobby started getting very sick, and ultimately, he ended up passing away. Again, the cause of death was listed as natural causes. After the death of Bobby, Judy and her kids moved back to Florida, and her eldest son, Michael, enlisted in the Army. Shortly after enlisting, though, he started getting sick, and he was hospitalized, and it was found that he was suffering from arsenic poisoning. And because of this poisoning, he ended up losing most of the feeling in his hands and his legs, and had to use braces to get around. Unfortunately, this did mean he was medically discharged from the Army. In 1980, Judy took both of her sons, James and Michael, canoeing when their canoe capsized. Judy and James were able to swim to shore, but unfortunately, because of Michael's braces, he was dragged down and he drowned. Not long after the death of her son, Judy began seeing a man by the name of John Gentry. They eventually got engaged, but in 1983, John was rushed to the hospital after his car exploded. Miraculously, John survived the explosion, and this is when police finally began looking into Judy. When the police searched John and Judy's home, they found vitamin pills that Judy had been giving to John, but when their lab investigated, they found that the pills were full of arsenic, and that's when they got a court order to exhume both of Judy's exes and her son Michael. Police discovered that all three men had signs of arsenic poisoning in their system, and that's when Judy was arrested. In 1984, she was convicted of the attempted murder of John Gentry and the murder of her son Michael, and in 1985 is when she was found guilty and convicted of the murders of Bobby and James, and that is also when she was sentenced to death. Judy was put to death on March 30th, 1998 in the electric chair. For her final meal, she had asparagus, broccoli, tomatoes, strawberries, and a cup of hot tea. And that brings us to the end of
A woman just woke up from a 2-year coma and was finally able to identify her attacker. 51-year-old Wanda Palmer was found on her couch in June of 2020. She'd suffered severe injuries from what police believed was a hatchet or an axe. She was unconscious but still breathing, and luckily she survived. But Wanda was in a coma, so without her statements and enough evidence, no one could be charged. 2 years later, Wanda woke up and was finally able to identify her attacker. Her brother, 55-year-old Daniel Palmer III. On Friday, he was arrested and charged with attempted murder and malicious wounding. His bail is $500,000.
If your hand touches the table, you lose. Right, okay. Oh, flip. Oh, no.
What's the magic trick? What? Ah! That's a 10 out of 0 out of 10. Next, in the magic trick watch. That is ridiculous. 9 out of 10. If I can turn this